The snow had come early that year, blanketing the ridgelines before the aspens had finished shedding their gold. October hadn't yet gone, but the wind bit like January, and the cattle huddled low along the southern fence lines of the Calvert Ranch. It was the kind of cold that sank past wool and hide right into the marrow, the kind that quieted even the wolves. Silas Calvert rode the southern line with his collar turned up and his gloved hands steady on the reins. His horse, an old blue roan named Dancer, knew the path better than he did by now. 34 winters on the same stretch of Wyoming land would do that, wear grooves into your soul, make a map of your habits. He hadn't planned on staying after his father died, meant to sell off the cattle, maybe lease the land, but grief had a way of anchoring a man, so he'd stayed, rebuilt the barn, hired back old hands who remembered his mother's laugh. Most days now were a quiet ache, dulled by routine and wind. That afternoon, he was checking for breaks in the wire. Snow lay soft and undisturbed between the posts, the drifts like sleeping bodies curled into the earth. He saw no sign of trespass, no tracks but his own, just the hush of white and the creak of leather, until he reached the west edge of the southern line where the creek curved close to the fence. There through the bare cottonwoods something moved, deliberate, slow, and not a deer. He dismounted, unslinging his rifle from the saddle. Snow muffled every sound but his breath and the thudding caution in his chest. He stepped lightly, boots sinking, eyes scanning. Then he saw her. At first just a shape against the tree line, long coat dark and soaked through, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, rim rimmed in frost. She leaned on a branch like it might be a cane, though she didn't look old. When she turned her face toward him, he caught the whites of her eyes, wide with exhaustion or fear. Maybe both. Silas didn't speak at first. Words felt too big for the moment. She blinked snowflakes from her lashes, lips cracked and blue-edged. "I don't mean trouble," she said, voice rasped raw. "I can see that," Silas replied. She sagged a little at that, the tension slipping from her shoulders. But she didn't smile, didn't ask for help either, just stood there, waiting for judgment. He looked her over again, not with suspicion, but with the trained eye of a man used to storms and livestock and things falling apart. "You been walkin' long?" She gave a short nod. "Since yesterday mornin'." Silas drew a slow breath, heavy with cold. "You hurt?" "No," she said, then after a pause, "not on the outside." He looked at her a long moment, and in that snowlight, silver pale, unflinching, he saw something settle inside himself. Not lightning, not a rush, just a quiet recognition like he'd been waiting on something and hadn't known it until now. He offered a hand. "Name, Silas." She looked at it like it might vanish, then finally stepped forward, took it in her own. Her skin was cold, rough with windburn. "Lena." "All right then, Lena," he said. "Let's get you warm." He led her to Dancer, helped her into the saddle despite her protests. Walked the horse back while the wind picked up and flung grit into the air. Lena held on tight to the horn, her eyes fixed forward, but Silas watched her when she wasn't looking. Not out of caution, out of something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. By the time they reached the ranch house, the sky was iron. Smoke curled from the chimney, and the dogs barked low, noses to the wind. Inside, the stove glowed hot, and Silas helped Lena out of her coat, fetched towels, made coffee. She moved like someone used to cold, used to hiding pain behind grit. But when she finally settled into the old rocker by the fire, her eyes softened, just a flicker. Enough to make him turn away, give her a moment. Silas didn't ask why she was walking through the snow alone, not that night. Some truths took time, and he wasn't one to rush a story before it was ready to be told. Instead, he sat in the chair across from her, hat on his knee, and listened to the wood pop and sigh. In the quiet, he felt something shift, deep and slow and steady, like the land thawing under spring sun, even when the snow was still thick on the ground. By morning, the wind had died, and a pearl-gray stillness blanketed the valley. Snow clung to the porch rails, to the bare branches of the junipers lining the drive. Inside, the fire had burned low but steady, leaving a hush of coals that pulsed with faint light. Lena woke stiff but dry, wrapped in an old quilt that smelled of cedar and horsehair. She hadn't meant to sleep, not really, just to rest her eyes, maybe, but the weight of the warmth, the ache behind her ribs, it had all pulled her under. Silas was already up. She heard his boots across the floorboards, the sound of a kettle rising to boil, then retreating. No talk, just movement, intent. The house creaked in its old bones. When she sat up, the rocker gave a soft groan. Her coat and hat hung from a peg near the stove, thawed now, dripping into a basin set beneath. Someone had laid a flannel shirt and wool socks across the footstool. She eyed them for a moment, then reached for the shirt, pulling it on over her own damp blouse. It smelled faintly of pine tar and soap. Silas didn't look up when she entered the kitchen. He stood at the stove, pouring black coffee into two chipped enamel mugs. When he finally turned, his gaze flicked once over her, appraising, not prying. "Didn't know how you take it," he said, holding out the cup. "Hot's enough," she replied. They sat across from one another at the scarred wooden table. The light through the window was pale, still tentative, but it cast soft shadows between them. "Storm's moving east," Silas said after a while. "You can see the ridge again." Lena nodded but didn't look. Her fingers curled around the cup, soaking in the heat. He waited, like he had all the time in the world. "You live here alone?" she asked finally. "For some time now." "No wife." Silas shook his head. Tried it once. She didn't much care for the silence. Lena's eyes flicked up at that, meeting his for the first time since waking. "I've found silence can be a kind of shelter." He didn't reply, but something in his expression shifted, like a small door opening just enough to let a breeze pass through. She didn't ask what happened with the wife. He didn't ask where she'd come from, or why her boots were worn to the lining, or why her hands trembled just a little when she lifted the cup. Instead, after the coffee, he handed her a pair of thick gloves and an extra scarf. "Come on," he said. "I'll show you the barn." The snow crunched underfoot, thin crust breaking with every step. Dancer waited near the gate, ears twitching. Two dogs trailed behind them, old blue heelers with graying muzzles and slow, deliberate strides. The barn was half stone, half weathered wood, built into a gentle slope. Inside, it smelled of hay and warmth and something deeper, beast breath, leather long seasons endured. Horses shifted in their stalls, nickering softly at Silas's approach. Lena walked slow, fingers brushing the railing. Her gaze softened as a dapple-gray gelding nosed her palm. "Zeke," Silas said, "gentlest soul on the place." "He's got kind eyes," Lena murmured. She didn't say much after that. Just stood there, hand resting against the horse's cheek. Silas didn't disturb her. He cleaned out a stall, refilled water troughs, moved with the practiced ease of someone who didn't need to fill silences with noise. When she finally turned back to him, there was something steadier in her face. "I can help," she said, "if you'll let me earn my keep a while." Silas wiped his hands on a rag. "You any good with a hammer?" She gave the barest of smiles. "Good enough." So he handed her a pair of gloves that fit near enough and led her to the south paddock, where the fence had bowed under the snow. She worked beside him without complaint, hands sure despite the cold, boots sinking into the drift. She didn't talk much, but she listened, and when she laughed, once at a stubborn nail that bent just wrong, it surprised even her. Later, they ate fried potatoes and eggs at the stove, straight from the pan, and drank more coffee with a splash of rye in it. Night came early again. Silas stoked the fire while Lena stood near the window, looking out over the white field beyond the porch. "You don't owe me shelter," she said, not turning. "I know. I won't stay long." Silas didn't answer. He just set the poker back in its stand and watched her reflection in the glass. Snowlight cast her in soft silver, touched the curve of her jaw, the quiet slope of her shoulders. Something stirred in him again, deeper this time, not desire. Not yet, just the knowledge of her presence and the unexpected comfort of it, like finding a candle still burning in an abandoned cabin. She turned then, eyes meeting his. And in that one look, a wordless weight passed between them, not promise, not demand. Just something that felt like the beginning of a long story neither of them had planned to write. She didn't ask where she would sleep. He didn't tell her. But when she walked back to the rocker, he brought her another quilt without a word, and left the door to the spare room open, just in case. The days settled into rhythm the way winter settles over a valley, slow, deliberate, and without asking permission. Lena rose early, sometimes before Silas, her boots quiet on the wood floor. She didn't linger near the stove or the fire, though her hands stayed red with cold. She seemed to prefer the open air, the clean breath of the dawn. And Silas, who'd long grown used to solitude, found himself watching for her shape against the morning mist. She fixed a sagging barn hinge one afternoon without being told, her hands deft with a wrench and bit of wire. Later, she mended a tear in the saddle blanket while Silas doctored a colt's leg. They worked together with the ease of people who don't need to speak to be understood. Silas noticed the way she carried weight in her shoulders, like she expected the ground to open under her at any moment. But she never flinched from work, never asked for more than her share of food or firewood. It wasn't submission, it was armor. Once, while stacking hay in the loft, he caught her humming a tune so low it was barely a breath. She stopped when she saw him watching, her mouth pressing shut like a gate slamming closed. "You sing." "Not in some time," she said, brushing hay from her sleeve. He nodded, as if he hadn't heard sorrow clinging to every note. That night a snowstorm rolled in wet and heavy, thundering against the roof like a beast trying to claw its way in. The lights flickered once and died. Silas brought out oil lamps and kindled the fire higher. Lena stood by the window, her eyes on the white blur beyond the glass. "You expecting someone to follow you?" he asked quietly. She didn't answer right away. "I left a place I shouldn't have stayed," she said at last. "But leaving don't mean you're free of it." Silas nodded, his jaw tightening. "No, it don't." She turned to him, pale light touching the line of her cheek. "You ever run?" "No," he said. "But I've been run off." That made her blink, the beginnings of a question in her mouth, but she let it fall. Instead, she walked toward the fire, sank into the rocker, and tucked her legs beneath her. Silas watched her a long moment. Then he took his seat too, poured 2 fingers of rye, and passed one glass across the distance between them. "To runnin'," she said, half a smile rising. "To staying," he replied. The storm raged until morning, driving snow so high the barn doors froze shut. Silas and Lena worked side by side to dig them clear, shoulders pressed against the wind. Inside, the animals waited in dim warmth, restless and wide-eyed. The fence out past the eastern gully had gone down beneath the weight of a broken pine. That took half the day to mend, but neither of them complained. When they paused, sitting on a split-rail fence eating bread and jerky from a tin, Silas handed her his gloves without a word. Her fingers were raw from the cold, and he noticed how she tried to hide the shaking. She hesitated before taking them, but did. "I was married once," she said then, eyes fixed on the snow. Silas didn't move, didn't speak. "He was kind at first, then he was, and I stayed too long." A woman learns how to disappear after a while, even if her body still there. Silas said nothing, but his jaw flexed. "I didn't come here to be saved," she said, voice firmer now. "I just came to stop running." "I ain't here to save anyone," he said, "but I don't scare easy neither." She looked at him then, and for the first time there was no guard in her eyes, just tired honesty and something softer waiting beneath. That night Silas found her in the barn after supper, sitting beside Zeke's stall, one hand resting against the old horse's neck. She looked up when he came in but didn't stand. "Couldn't sleep," she said. "I figured." He leaned against the beam, the quiet around them thick with the scent of hay and wood smoke. Snow fell in slow flakes outside, whispering against the roof. "You ever wonder what makes a place feel like home?" she asked. "Sometimes I think it's just the people who don't leave," he said. She nodded. "Maybe, or maybe it's where you finally stop looking over your shoulder." They sat in the hush a while longer, and when Silas finally offered her his coat, she didn't refuse. She pulled it close, and he sat down beside her in the straw. There was no touch, no confession. Just 2 people who had survived their separate storms, breathing the same barn-warmed air, letting the silence hold what neither of them yet had the courage to say. But in that moment, as the snowlight filtered through the loft slats, something settled deeper than words. Not love, not yet, but the seed of it, quiet, unspoken, and very much alive. By mid-November, the sun rarely lifted more than a hand's breadth above the ridge before dipping westward again. The days were brief, but not idle. There was always something that needed fixing: frozen troughs, a stubborn plow, shingles torn by wind. And now Lena was part of that rhythm, steady as snowfall, quiet as breath. She had found her place in the chores without fuss. Mornings, she mucked stalls while Silas chopped wood. Evenings, she helped him oil tack and mend broken harness. He never gave her the easier half, and she never asked for it. One morning, he found her kneeling near the stream, chipping a path through the ice so the cattle could drink. Her coat flapped open at the throat, and her cheeks were red with cold. But her hands moved sure and calm, like she'd done this every winter of her life. "You've done ranch work before," he said. She sat back on her heels and looked up at him. "When I was a girl. My father had a place in Nebraska, before he died and before my mother married again." He waited. She thought she was saving us. Turned out she was just lonely. He offered his hand to help her up. She took it, rising without a word, and didn't let go right away. When she did, her fingers lingered against his palm like they might remember it later in the dark. Later that week, a supply run took them both into town. Lena hadn't been farther than the property line since arriving, and Silas saw the way her shoulders tensed as they hit the road, how she scanned every rider and storefront. Still, she kept her chin up and her hat low. Bridge Hollow was a scatter of buildings wrapped around a single muddy street. A dry goods store, a livery, a church with paint peeling off its steeple. Folks knew Silas, nodded or raised a hand as he passed, but they stared longer than usual at the woman riding beside him. At the feed store, she stayed near the wagon while Silas hauled bags of grain. The storekeeper, a man named Ezra with a mouth full of tobacco and a long memory, eyed her as he handed Silas the tally. "New hand." "Something like that," Silas said. Ezra snorted. "Don't look like she talks much." "She talks enough," Silas said, voice even, though there was a weight behind it. They left without further words, and Lena didn't ask what was meant by the exchange. But as they passed the edge of town, she said, "You don't owe me your defense." Silas glanced sideways at her. It wasn't defense, just truth. She looked forward again, a faint crease between her brows. That night back at the ranch, the moon rose wide and full. It painted the snow in shades of blue and silver, casting long shadows across the pasture. After supper, Silas stepped out onto the porch, nursing a pipe and listening to the wind. Lena joined him quietly, her arms folded, her breath a cloud in the cold. "I was afraid to come with you today," she said. "I know. But I was more afraid to stay behind." He looked at her, moonlight catching the curve of her cheek. "Why?" She didn't answer right away. "Because I didn't want to feel like I was hiding anymore. I've done enough of that." He nodded. "You weren't hiding here." She glanced at him. "No, I was." They stood in silence, the kind that doesn't need filling. Inside, the dog stirred. A barn owl called out across the field. Then Lena said, soft and sure, "You make it easy to breathe." Silas felt something catch in his chest, not pain. Just a shift like a door opening that he hadn't realized was closed. "I've been waitin' a long time," he said, voice low. "Didn't know what for, not really." Lena turned toward him, eyes clear in the moonlight. "I've never known what home felt like," she said, "not truly." He reached for her hand, not to pull her close, but just to hold it, to feel the weight of it, the realness. She let him, fingers sliding into his without hesitation. And in that moment, standing on the porch beneath the winter sky, no vows were made, no promises carved into stone, but something passed between them, quiet, solid, unshakable, not the end of the story. But the place where two lives, long scattered, began to thread toward something steady. The thaw came slow that year. March rolled in like a grizzled dog, all bark and brittle wind, with the sun still playing shy behind banks of cloud. But the mornings lengthened, and the creek began to murmur beneath its sheath of ice. Somewhere in the distance, meadowlarks returned to sing. By then, Lena had taken to keeping a ledger of the cattle in the study, her pen scratchy and precise. She built shelves for Silas's tools, rehinged the trapdoor to the cellar, and carved a whistle from cottonwood that made the pups bark and whirl in circles. Silas watched her with a kind of quiet reverence. He never said the word love, but it clung to him when he handed her the last cup of coffee in the morning, or when he leaned a ladder for her without being asked. In the long glances he gave her while she salted meat or hung linens in the wind. In the way he stood just a little closer when strangers rode by on the ridge. One afternoon, he found her in the grove near the creek, clearing out deadfall. She wore his old work gloves and had a strand of hair falling loose from her braid. She didn't see him approach. "You buildin' something?" he asked. She looked up, half smiling. "A place to think." He moved to stand beside her. The snow had mostly melted here, and the ground was soft beneath their boots. "You miss where you came from?" he asked. "I miss the girl I was before I stopped trusting people." Silas bent to help lift a branch, his voice quiet. "I reckon she's not gone. Just hiding out somewhere." Lena didn't answer, but she reached for another piece of kindling and placed it on the growing pile. They worked together until dusk. When the cold began to bite again, he handed her his coat without a word, and they walked back to the house together, close enough that their shoulders brushed. Spring came in fits and starts. A calf was born breech one muddy morning, and Lena was there beside him, sleeves rolled to her elbows, sweat streaking her temple as she worked. When the little one finally slid free and coughed against the straw, she sat back in the stall, panting. Silas crouched beside her, breath still hard in his lungs. He looked at the calf, then at her. "You saved him," he said. Lena shook her head. "We both did. You don't flinch from much." She smiled, small and tired. "Flinching never kept me safe." He reached out then, slow, brushing a bit of straw from her hair. She closed her eyes at the touch. When she opened them again, there was something bare and clear in her gaze. "You scare me," she said. Silas blinked. "Why?" "Because you're the first thing in a long time that feels like it might last." He didn't speak. Just looked at her, this woman who had walked into his life in snow and silence and rebuilt his world without ever asking for a place in it. Later, they stood in the barn doorway watching the sky turn gold over the pasture. The dogs lay curled in the straw, and the calf suckled at its mother's flank. "I don't want to go back to being alone," Lena said. "You don't have to," Silas replied. She reached for his hand, and this time it wasn't a cautious thing. It was full and certain and warm. Inside the house, the fire waited, the shelves she'd built, the rocker that had cradled her that first cold night. The scent of pine still clung to the quilts. They didn't speak more that evening. Just shared the quiet and a meal and the sense that whatever storm might come next, they wouldn't face it alone. And when she stood to bank the fire before bed, Silas reached out and touched her wrist. "Lena." She turned. "I waited my whole life," he said, "and didn't even know it, until you looked at me back in that snowlight." She didn't cry, though her eyes shimmered. She just leaned forward and rested her brow to his. That was enough. By June, the land had turned lush and green, the grass climbing up the fence posts and wildflowers nodding in the breeze. The mountains loomed blue and full of thunder in the distance, and the creek ran fast with meltwater. Birds nested under the eaves of the barn, and bees hummed low in the orchard where Lena had planted apple starts, their slender stems swaying like children just learning to walk. The ranch breathed in full again. Not just fed and repaired, but lived in, touched daily by hands that cared. Lena's handwriting lined the ledgers now. Her flint sat beside the matches on the mantel. Her boots rested beside Silas's by the door. There was no announcement. No church bells, no ring, but the valley knew, the dogs knew. Even the cattle stood closer when she passed. That summer, a man rode in from the east, dressed too fine for the land, with eyes that never quite stopped moving. Silas met him at the gate, his rifle leaning easy in one hand. Lena stayed inside, watching through the window, her breath shallow. "Looking for someone," the man said. "Lady, about your height. Maybe pass this way come winter." Silas's eyes didn't waver. "No one like that here." The man tipped his hat, too slow. "Sure about that?" Silas let the silence stretch, hard and clean. "I'm sure." The man didn't argue. He turned his horse and rode back down the trail without so much as a goodbye. Still, Silas stayed outside long after the dust settled, eyes on the road. That night, he didn't mention it to Lena. He didn't need to. She came to him in the dark without a word, and he held her until the weight of memory passed like a summer storm, loud, wild, but gone by morning. By autumn, Lena had built a root cellar with her own hands. She canned peaches, braided garlic, and learned how to mend fence line in the dark. Silas, in turn, learned to listen closer, to sit with her during long silences that meant more than words. He never pried, never asked for more than she could give. But when she reached for his hand during a thunderstorm, he closed his fingers around hers and didn't let go. One evening, she found him in the study, cleaning his rifle, the window open to the gold-slick light. "I've been thinking," she said. He looked up. "I don't want to leave." He set the cloth down. "I know. I want to stay through winter and spring, and whatever else comes." Sela stood slow and sure, crossed the room until they were face to face. "You already have." They stood like that for a long while, the wind moving through the trees outside, soft and constant. Then she pressed her hand to his chest, over the old break in his ribs where a horse had once kicked hard. He covered it with his own. "You're not afraid anymore," he said. "No," she whispered. "Because I found something worth being brave for." That night they lit the fire early and let the dogs curl close. Lena pulled the rocker near and sat with a book in her lap, the dogs' heads resting on her feet. Silas watched her from the table, carving new handles for the kitchen drawers. He'd sand them smooth by morning, coat them in linseed oil, fit them in by hand. Outside, the first frost dusted the fields in silver. The creek ran slower now, preparing to sleep. The house stood warm, quiet, alive. And in that small corner of Wyoming, under a sky wide enough to hold all the years they'd lost, two people lived on, scarred, steadfast, and wholly found. Not because they were saved, but because they were seen.